Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar featuring the latest blue paper commissioned by the Ocean Panel on the Ocean Genome. My name is Inês Branco, and I am part of the Ocean Panel Secretariat, based in London. Today's webinar will be moderated by our Program Director, Christian Telecki. We will hear from the authors of the paper, along with our distinguished guest, Ambassador Olai Uludong from Palau, who will join us for opening remarks. We will then have a panel discussion with the authors, after which we will take questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We kindly request that when posing your questions, you direct them to the presenter who you seek an answer from. So, without further ado, I'll hand things over to Christian.
Thank you very much, Inês. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to many of you who have joined this launch of the Blue Paper commissioned by the high-level panel on the Ocean Genome. I'm delighted to say that over 800 of you have registered from 75 countries, and so we're thrilled that you could be with us today to explore the Ocean Genome further and this blue paper. I should say from the outset, while our interest and passion for the ocean links us here on this, this webinar, unfortunately, the other thing that links us around the world for the moment is the impact and the challenges which the global pandemic of COVID-19 faces with us at the moment. We do hope that all of you remain well and safe in this unprecedented time, and we look forward to engaging with you in person someday soon. But for the time being, we are going to talk about the Ocean Genome. We know at the moment that new technologies are developing at exponential velocity, breadth and depth, and are providing an unprecedented understanding into insights of the ocean genome. All this genetic material present in marine biodiversity is certainly the foundation of life in the sea. But we know that this is eroding from overexploitation, habitat loss, degradation, as well as other drivers we even know about it before we even know about it or document it. But the question is, or maybe several questions, if I may, as a setup to our webinar. Can we afford to be losing this amazing biodiversity and the secrets it may hold to benefiting humanity, especially when we think in light of the rapid search for cures for COVID-19? Shouldn't this be the domain for all and not limited to a handful of countries to make these discoveries and benefits? What does the governance regime look like to ensure equitable use and address these emerging and existing conservation issues, especially in the context of the high seas? And we'll learn a little bit more about that shortly. This paper certainly talks about the opportunities to develop conservation and management measures, as well as commercial applications. The importance of the ocean genome, recognizing that land genetic diversity is but a fraction of that found in the ocean. What are the barriers to conserve and sustainably use and equitably share the economic benefit of the ocean genome? And what are the opportunities for action? So we hope to have a very interesting and engaging webinar this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever this may find you. Here is the run of show. We'll shortly be turning to Ambassador Uludong for some opening remarks. Then we'll show a brief video to introduce you to all of the authors that contributed to this. Only a small number do we have on the call. Then we'll dig into the research findings, get into the meat of the paper, and pull some of the sort of key messages and insights that are coming out of it. And then we'll have a panel discussion. I'll take the moderator's privilege of asking some questions and putting some of the panelists on the spot to learn a little bit more and glean some more from the work that they've done in this paper. And then we'll open up to you for the audience question and answer time. This doesn't preclude you at the moment using the question and answer window, but we would ask you to be either both simple, clear, and also direct your question. You may say this could be to the all panelists, or this may be specifically to one of the panelists that we have joining us today. I will say that we will not get to all of your questions, but we will certainly note them and let the authors know, and they may wish to follow up with you separately. I also think it's quite helpful when you're making your question, if you wouldn't mind, or if it's not clear in your name file, the organization you represent, because it also gives us a good sense of where you're coming from to be able to target the answers to your question. As we said, I'm Christian Teleke, leading the Secretary for the High-Level Panel for Sustainable Ocean Economy based at the World Resource Institute. On the line, we have Ambassador Oladong, who is the permanent representative of Palau to the United Nations and a high-level panel Sherpa. Also joining us, Kristen Grud-Colvert from Oregon State University, Shiva Timbasetti from the London School of Economics, Rachel Weinberg from the University of Cape Town, Robert Blasiak from the Stockholm Museum Center in Sweden, and Professor Alex Rogers, who is the Science Director at RevOcean. You are all welcome and delighted you could join us for this webinar. So first, let me say a few words about the high-level panel, just in case some of you may not be familiar with it. The high-level panel itself is an initiative that brings together 14 world leaders, 14 heads of state and government who are linked together by the importance of the ocean. These heads of state are really looking at what are the sorts of solutions that can be brought to bear, driving from governance, technology, and finance, and really creating a new contract or a new relationship with the ocean where we can produce sustainably, where we can protect effectively, and where we can equitably prosper. And this is all with a view of supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, not just SDG 14, but how do we use SDG 14 to access more of the other Sustainable Development Goal targets that are there? Because we all know that there's a key to many other of those challenges that the world faces. The high-level panel itself has commissioned these 16 blue papers, of which this is one. You'll see that we have a good geographic distribution of those high-level panel members themselves from a whole range of geographies, different sources of sets of economy, and really bringing a diverse set of views to the panel itself. And I think what I always find interesting about this is not just a formal construct like the G20 or G7, but actually this is a construct that's linked together for the importance of the ocean, importance for economic health, importance for planetary health, and certainly we now know even more for human health. And just some statistics here, that the 14 governments there, if you add them all up, 20% of the world's shipping fleets, representing 20% of the world's fisheries, 30% of the world's exclusive economic zones, and 30% of the world's coastline. So a very good geographic distribution and really encompassing a whole range of the issues that are facing the ocean and concern for that in the various economies and geographies. The knowledge products of the panel themselves, if I can just give you a little bit of an outline, because I think it's important to see where the blue papers sit in this knowledge generation of the panel. The blue papers are 16 that have been commissioned by the high-level panel themselves. They are there to support the workings and inform the deliberations of the high-level panel themselves. And just to give you some statistics here, there are more than 200 authors from 50 countries that contributed to these blue papers. And I'll give you a sense of the timeline in just a moment. Within that, we also, and hopefully many of you will have seen this, the ocean as a solution for climate change. This was the sort of the solution set that was offered last September by the commission by the high-level panel for the IPCC report on the ocean and cryosphere. I do encourage you to have a look at that. We note that it's being taken up voraciously by the private sector and indeed a number of governments around the world. Then this leads us into the Foundational Sustainable Ocean Economy Report, a longer report that starts to draw a lot of the blue paper knowledge together and really think about what is it that we need to have to achieve and how do we build on the amazing progress that we've made so far to see to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve by 2030. So this also will be released later this year, approximately the beginning of next year. And then finally, the transformations themselves, or the recommendations. This is the element, or the only element that will be signed off and endorsed by the high-level panel members themselves. So all 14 heads of state will, this will be the package that they put forward to the world with really thinking about the ideas for change and really putting on the table some actions that if we all took them and collectively implemented them, whether in the private or public sectors, that we would make real progress over the next decade. Just to give you a sense in terms of the timeline of those blue papers, we've released 5 of them so far. I hope that you've had a chance to view those. Those are the future of food from the sea, the expected impacts of climate change on the ocean economy, technology data and new models for sustainably managing ocean resources, and how to distribute the benefits of ocean equitably, and finally, IUU fishing and associated drivers. Those can be found on the Ocean Panel website, oceanpanel.org/blue-papers, and you should be able to access those. They all, of course, are not there. We'll be releasing those and making them available as we launch them going forward between now and the end of October. Following the launch of this paper, the Ocean Genome paper, we'll have the next blue paper launch on biodiversity governance and thresholds. That's being hosted by our colleagues in the government of Mexico. This will be in Spanish, and again, will be broadcast live. We then have integrated ocean management on the 12th, plastics and other pollutants on the 27th of May, 8th of June, perhaps looking at the transition to a sustainable ocean economy on that day. And then on the 24th of June, mining, and energy. That's just a snapshot, but what we aim to do in the coming days is actually put that entire schedule on the website for you to put into your diaries, and hope that you will join us, and if nothing else, spend an hour and a half with us off and on, so that you can learn more about some of these from some of the best and finest minds around the world on some of these subjects. So again, thank you for joining us today. I'd now like to turn to Ambassador Oladong. Olai, welcome to our webinar here on the release of the blue paper on the ocean genome. Of course, you are the Sherpa for President Ramengasau of Palau, and we're certainly delighted that you're here. You're also co-chair along with Vidar Helgesen of Norway on the panel. With amongst all your other hats and duties that you're doing, we certainly know you're a very busy woman. Delighted that you could join us, even briefly, to offer some comments. I mean, Olai, thinking about this as far as the relevance of this ocean genome, you are a co-facilitator of the BBNJ, or the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction process and negotiations. And we were hoping that you might give us some reflections on a little bit on the Ocean Panel's work, but also how does this fit into the ecosystem of the negotiations going on at the UN? So, Olai, over to you.
Thank you, Christian. Well, firstly, on behalf of the Ocean Panel Sherpas, let me thank the authors of this blue paper on the ocean genome for their work. Together with other blue papers, this forms the important scientific analysis and foundation for the panel's work on identifying transformations to get towards sustainable ocean economy. It has become a commonplace now in the ocean community to highlight that we know less about the world's ocean that we do about the surface of the moon. And this is especially true in the case of the genetic diversity of marine species. I have the honor of holding a number of paddles in our ocean canoe, and I want to address each one of these in turn in reflecting on the blue paper's findings. Let me start closest to home. Christian is correct. I serve as Sherpa on the Ocean Panel on behalf of Palau President Tommy Ramengasau Jr., who co-chairs the panel alongside Norway's Prime Minister Erna Solberg. Palau, as a large ocean state, has the responsibility over a large area within national jurisdiction. This year marks the start of the implementation of the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, a no-take area of 500,000 square kilometers. The Palau National Marine Sanctuary is part of our broader ocean economy. It is linked to the quality tourism industry that we are building, which is now heavily hit by travel closures as a result of the pandemic. And that tourism industry is often drawn towards the aesthetic value of diverse reef life. I mean, that is why diverse and sports fishers have been coming to Palau over the years. But as diverse reef life is important, not just for aesthetic reasons, but for the health of ocean ecosystems as a whole. And this is where the ocean genome comes in. In some sections of the reef in our Rock Island areas, coral reefs have been able to thrive despite increasing acidity in the reef area. Understanding why this is the case, right down to its genetic features, is important for understanding the broader impacts of ocean acidification and potential ways to increase reef resilience. We're incredibly concerned about the daunting future that last year's IPCC special report on the ocean paints for the future of coral reefs in a changing climate. Even at just 1.5 degrees of warming, all reefs are expected to be adversely affected with its impacts for food security and our visitors' economy. So knowing why and how some reefs can thrive amid increased acidity is an example of how an attention to the ocean genome also can deliver wider benefits. I think that it is also interesting how the blue paper highlights MPAs as an important way of conserving the ocean genome. The way in which the world has thought about MPAs has grown, not just as biodiversity solution, but also as a climate solution, and now as part of the storehouse of genetic knowledge of life on Earth. Our marine sanctuary is our contribution to that, but the fact that we share one ocean also means that we have to strengthen the storehouse of the ocean as a whole. The second paddle that I have the honor to hold is as a co-facilitator for the UN Ocean Conference preparatory process. As you all know, the conference itself has been postponed, but its theme on science and innovation for a healthy ocean speaks directly to the ocean genome. The conference aims to drive ambition towards achieving SDG 14 on life underwater, and utilizing science and innovation to accelerate ways to reduce human impacts of the ocean is key, so that we can continue to prosper from the ocean's resources. The conference also marks the start of the UN Decade of Ocean Science, a 10-year push to ramp up scientific collaboration among countries and improve our knowledge base. If we don't understand and appreciate the value of what lies in our ocean, we're not going to be getting that balance between conservation and sustainable use right. One of the decade's slogans is the science we need for the ocean we want, and strengthening how we generate and apply knowledge from the ocean is essential if we are going to be able to transform our relationship with the ocean. We are consulting on the declaration among states, but one thing that countries highlighted in the preparatory meeting that we had at the beginning of February was about the importance of sharing data more widely so that it can be used more widely. And I think one thing that countries often have in mind in talking about data is precisely this kind of genomic knowledge that is more challenging for developing countries to access. The third paddle that I hold is the facilitator of the BBNJ processes working group on capacity building and transfer of marine technology. We're getting close, but are not quite there yet with the agreement. And I hope that completing the voyage can be part of our blue recovery for the COVID-19 pandemic. The fact that capacity building itself is one of our 4 cornerstones of the BBNJ package tells us about the inequalities that currently exist in high seas activities, especially in relating to our ability to implement an agreement to conserve and use the high seas. The blue paper documents some of these disparities between countries in their ability to engage in marine biodiscovery activities. I think for many developing countries, and especially island states, improving capacities to undertake marine research both within national waters and the high seas is one of the more tangible outcomes that the BBNJ process can catalyze. Ultimately, the high seas have to be governed fairly, and that extends to genetic knowledge. But capacities to gather and analyze and apply this knowledge is heavily uneven. In Palau, our scientific knowledge of our reefs and ocean ecosystem is driven by the Palau International Coral Reef Center. Its director, Dr. Golbu, is among some of the authors of the other blue papers and is part of the Ocean Panel's expert group. But PICRC, like other institutions in the Pacific and in developing countries, more generally find it's challenging to engage in the more sophisticated work on genetics. The answer to that has to be deeper international cooperation, but the how is obviously the contentious bits that are still all at stake in the BBNJ negotiations. There are open questions about the scope of countries' obligations. How are we going to cooperate and the modalities for doing so? There's also a fairly long annex on types of capacity building that is proposed in the current president's draft. Many of these, if not all, are applicable to questions of how to strengthen capacities in relation to the ocean genome. So they also helpfully paint a compelling picture of how to get to a more fairly governed ocean in terms of its genetic knowledge. But of course, all this is still subject to our final haul of negotiations, and we'll have to see what final settlement countries can make. Finally, let me once again thank the authors of the paper for their efforts in bringing this paper to fruition and for presenting their findings today to a wider audience. Of course, let me also thank the Ocean Panel Secretary, Christian, and his team from WRI and the Ocean Panel Expert Group for overseeing and guiding the blue paper process. We have many more to come. Thank you, Christian.
And thank you very much for that, Olai, and spending the time with you. I always love how you and your president talk about being in the same canoe. And I think if these days, these past months and days do not represent that more starkly than being in that same canoe, it is truly apropos to refer to that in that way. And how you have how you're able to manage all these different paddles, I am not sure, but we certainly hope that we can continue to help you in that leadership and championing the ocean health and the BBNJ. And certainly, thank you again for spending time with us, and we certainly wish you well in the continued hard work that you are doing, I know, on the ocean and everything else, and indeed trying to keep the people of Palau safe. So again, thank you, and we will certainly be looking forward to your continued leadership in this area.
Thank you, Christian.
So with that, we now are going to move to, I'd like to introduce the authors, and we have a little video to do that, but I would also like to acknowledge that you'll see more than the authors that we have on this webinar today. That's just logistically, it's difficult to have all the authors on the call, but I certainly acknowledge that many of them are on the call at the moment. And again, we thank you for your contribution and all your efforts into putting this amazing and fascinating paper together. So with that, could I have the video, please?
My name is Robert Blasiak. I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I'm interested in how scientists, governments, and industry can work together to conserve and sustainably manage the ocean.
I'm Dr. Shiva Kambashetty, Associate Professor of Intellectual Property Law at the London School of Economics. My research focus is on patent law, and I'm particularly interested in how international intellectual property norms can facilitate the equitable and sustainable exploitation of natural resources.
My name is Kirsten Grorud-Colvert, and I'm a marine ecologist on the faculty at Oregon State University. I study ocean ecosystems and how best to protect them and use them sustainably.
My name is Rachel Weinberg, and I'm a professor and research chair at the University of Cape Town, where I do research on social and environmental dimensions of the bioeconomy, focused particularly on equity, ethics, and environmental justice.
My My name is Adelino Canario. I'm a professor of cell biology and the director of the Center of Marine Sciences at the University of Algarve. My research is on fish reproduction and chemical communication, and we use genomes to study the physiology and evolution.
My name is Alex Rogers. I'm the science director from RevOcean. I'm a scientist working in the areas of deep ocean ecology, coral reef ecology, and ocean policy related to human activities in the ocean and the impacts they have on marine ecosystems.
Hello, my name is Carlos Duarte. I'm a professor of marine science at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. And I'm delighted to have contributed to the blue paper and the paper on the ocean genome. And I'm also a member of the expert group supporting the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy.
I'm Colette Wabnitz. I'm a research associate currently with the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and I'm interested in how social ecological systems respond to change.
I'm Kerry Sink from the South African National Biodiversity Institute and Nelson Mandela University. I work to explore, understand, and support effective management of biodiversity for current and future generations.
Hi, my name is Jessica Da Silva. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the South African National Biodiversity Institute in Cape Town. My research is focused on understanding population dynamics and connectivity across varying landscapes using a variety of molecular techniques. Also, my projects tend to be focused on threatened and endangered species.
My name is Marcel Jaspers. I'm Professor of Chemistry at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, and also Director of the Marine Biodiscovery Centre. My expertise is in discovering new drugs from the oceans, and particularly from deep-sea marine bacteria.
Hi, my name is Narcisa Bandarra. I work in the Institute of the Sea and Atmosphere located in Lisbon, Portugal. I am a researcher and the head of aquaculture, upgrading and bioprospecting division. My main expertise area is marine biotechnology, more focused in lipid biochemistry.
So there you go, the full complement of authors introducing themselves. I think you'll agree that we have an amazing diversity of not only expertise, but geography. People spread around the world contributing to this particular blue paper. Please do keep your questions coming in. We'll be trying to take those when we get into the audience question and answer session. But we now want to transition into some of the details of the blue paper. And I'm delighted to call upon two authors who contributed to that. Shiva Tambasetti from the London School of Economics and Kirsten Garud-Colvert from the University of Oregon. So over to you both, and take us through and tell us more exciting thoughts and ideas that came up in this ocean genome paper. Over to you.
Thank you, Christian, so much. Thank you to you and the entire WRI team for hosting this webinar. Thanks to the Ocean Panel for commissioning all these blue papers and this really important work at a pivotal time for our world. And thank you also to Ambassador Uladong for setting the stage and all your work in this realm. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. And as Christian said, I'm speaking coming from a group of co-leads, co-authors. You saw the diversity in the video, and we have been working together these many months to bring together our diverse perspectives and expertise. And I think one of the really amazing outcomes of this process has been to see the interconnectedness of the ocean genome and what that means for us and for our planet. So our first task was to define what do we mean by the ocean genome. Now, the ocean genome is the ensemble of genetic material that's present in all marine biodiversity, including both the physical genes and the information they encode. So the ocean genome is truly incredible. We know that life has existed in the ocean about 3 times longer than on land, and as a result, incredible biodiversity. Some 2.2 million eukaryotic species, are estimated to exist. And if that's the case, then we've only described about 10% of them. And on top of that, the prokaryotic marine species, which are even more by weight in the ocean, we know they're more diverse, but also less known. So these are incredible organisms. They are adapted to the most extreme environments on our planet, extreme depth, extreme pressure, extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme darkness. And so you can imagine that all these adaptations that allow them to live in these areas are also really critical for what plays out as their marine genetic diversity. So the question is, have we cracked the ocean genome? Now, there have been rapid advances in sequencing technologies and bioinformatics, and that's what this slide is showing. On the left hand, you see this precipitous decline in sequencing costs over the last 20 years. And on the right hand, in the orange graph, you see a flip in the precipitous increase in the amount of genetic sequence data that's available in databases, to the tune of doubling in size about every 18 months in recent history. So we have a huge amount of information, but the reality is that the capacity to explore the ocean genome is concentrated within a handful of countries. And this is particularly important for things like the BBNJ negotiation process, like Ambassador Ladome just mentioned. And so treating the genetic sequence data as a universal resource presents both opportunities and challenges moving forward. Why is the ocean genome important? We know that a suite of benefits come from the ocean genome. When we talk about biodiversity, we're really talking about the ocean genome, the diversity within genes, within species, between species, across entire ocean ecosystems. This is the biodiversity that underpins species in the ocean, their ability to adapt and to be resilient and resistant to some of the impacts that are affecting the ocean today, including global change. Now, we care about the abundance and the diversity of these species because they underpin provisioning services that our entire planet relies on. Fisheries, which account for about 17% of the animal protein that's consumed worldwide, the livelihoods that are tied up with utilizing these resources, and also the genetic diversity underlies the structure and function of so many organisms that provide things like coastal protection from storms and other threats to the coast. In addition to that, all these adaptations that marine organisms have are part of this incredible amount of commercial innovation and exploration around products that we can derive from the ocean genome. Anything from pharmaceuticals like anti-cancer treatments, cosmetics, nutraceuticals like omega-3 fatty acids, and enzymes such as the ones that are currently being used in the test kits for coronavirus, which were derived from a hydrothermal vent organism. So the benefits are enormous, and safeguarding the ocean genome is really crucial for ensuring that we can continue to utilize these benefits into the future. Yet the benefits from the ocean genome are under threat. We know that human activities have been intensifying globally. This threatens marine species survival. There's a rapid loss of genetic diversity, and there's a whole list of reasons why this diversity is threatened. Among them, and primary among them, overexploitation and the different impacts of climate change. We're seeing some of these, the evidence of some of these threats taking a toll already. For example, IUCN estimates that already 25% of marine species are at risk, marine mammal species are at risk of extinction. And because organisms in the ocean are really sensitive to very narrow temperature windows, we expect that actually as global conditions change, they'll be likely 2 times more vulnerable to things like local extinctions compared to organisms on land. Because so much of the ocean is underexplored, as we heard, less so than the face of the moon, species risk is likely vastly underestimated. And these threats don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in different places, in different times, and also can be additive and synergistic on top of each other. So because of that, we have this complex mosaic of these threats to the ocean genome, and this leads to different challenges for innovation and equity based on where the threats play out. On top of this, ocean protection has lagged. We still are only at 2.5% of the ocean protected in fully or highly protected areas that are implemented, so that changes are happening on the water. So coordinated action is needed to address these threats and to sustain the ocean genome. Now, we've discussed the range of benefits. You see them summarized in this blue box here from the paper. Ecological, provisioning, commercial, literally scaling from the level of genetic base pairs all the way up to entire ocean ecosystems. And the use of the ocean genome must be designed for sustainability. What this means is setting aside areas as storehouses of genetic diversity so that we can preserve and conserve these genetic resources. This can be done through things like marine protected areas, also other effective area-based conservation measures where sustainable use and cultural values can be balanced with conservation. But really, this is part of a whole ocean approach. These need to be paired with effective management outside, and that's certainly part of what the discussions have been at the BBNJ negotiations, as well as other platforms around the world. So our report identified some key opportunities to protect marine genetic diversity. And our goal was really to highlight these tangible actions that can be undertaken in a whole ocean approach to protecting marine genetic diversity. We know that specific actions need to include an increase in ocean protection. Now the scientific research says that really we're talking more along the lines of 30% of the ocean protected in order to really achieve productivity and resilience to our ocean systems and to ourselves. We know they need to be fully and highly protected to achieve that. We also know that it can't just stop at the borders of things like MPAs. It needs to be a focus on conserving and sustainably using genetic diversity across the entire ocean. Genetic monitoring is going to be very key to this, and strategic environmental assessments will be part of that, as well as reporting on where we see genetic diversity, areas that are important for conservation and use. And we need to take that knowledge and apply it moving forward. We know that these needs for sustainable use and conservation, in order to be successful, they need to be inclusive and equitable in their outcomes. And so our findings that the ocean genome is so interconnected, these benefits are so vital, so interconnected, leads to legal and social implications as well. So now I'll turn it over to my co-lead, Shiva, and she'll talk more about that.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. So I start by presenting the problem of inequity around the ocean genome and the implications of that inequity. Now, data shows that sampling often takes place in the territories of low and middle income tropical countries, yet high cost, advanced technologies and expertise involved means that marine exploration is undertaken by entities in a handful of high income countries. So perhaps it's not surprising that scientific publication count as well as markers of patent applications show the dominance of these high income countries. The model of international collaboration here also continues to be characterized by a private company working with entities located in high-income countries. For instance, despite active marine biodiscovery programs in the Western Indian Ocean, few African countries have engaged actively in international collaborative efforts. But we also know that benefits of marine biodiscovery extend far beyond the successful development of a product or technology and include, for instance, the availability of biorepositories of local species for further investigation, highly skilled researchers, sophisticated equipment, and an improved research profile. All of these together can boost the capacity of a region to thrive via industries while contributing to the protection and sustainable use of biodiversity itself. And for these reasons, biodiscovery and innovation is inextricably linked to the conservation and sustainable use of the ocean genome. Many factors impact on equity. These include disparities in research capacity, technology, and finances, which prevent the inclusion of poorer countries in marine biotechnology efforts. If we consider these with the findings Kirsten reported, for instance, on the vast quantities of sequence data being made available online, the inability to access such data for any one of these reasons is particularly damaging to equity and can be perceived by some countries as a loss of control and national patrimony, particularly where sovereign genetic resources are involved. Responsible and inclusive innovation is offered in our report as an interactive process by which societal actors and innovators can build ethical, sustainable, and socially desirable innovation processes. It explicitly includes developing solutions to the problems of the most marginalized communities. Of course, there are factors that make the realization of inclusive innovation difficult, and I present two here. First, devising equitable research partnerships is not a simple technical problem to resolve, for instance, by entering into contractual terms under a benefit sharing agreement. Instead, truly equitable collaborations need solutions to all the different kinds of disparities that come up. Secondly, the dominance of private incentives such as IP rights can skew innovation to the detriment of other socially desirable innovations that end up underfunded. Now, this is a general problem in science, but particularly acute one here because of the cost and long timelines to commercial success. So inclusive innovation directs us to amplify ethical and humanitarian drivers, such as solutions to neglected diseases and furthering scientific insight into conservation agendas. So responsible and inclusive innovation can lead to equitable outcomes for all. Apart from gaps in scientific understanding and disparities in capacity, the report also finds that fragmented ocean governance framework is a significant factor. Here I present some of the context of this fragmented landscape. Now, the Nagoya Protocol while it has the ability to stamp out the worst cases of biopiracy, is inapplicable to 2/3 of the ocean and does not include sequence information and data. It also does not effectively address transboundary issues which are of critical importance to the ocean genome. Intellectual property, such as patents, provide important incentives, but they also inhibit the diffusion of technology that we need for responsible and inclusive innovation. The wide variation in how these different measures are implemented globally and domestically means that the fragmented ocean governance is a real and present threat to conservation, sustainable use, and the realization of economic benefits for all from the ocean genome. So our analysis of these challenges directly led us to define the ocean genome as including both physical genes and the information they encode. Here I would like to use 3 examples from the ongoing BBNJ process. The ocean genome is a unifying factor, which means that we need to move away from fragmented ways in which access and use of marine genetic resources, conservation outcomes, and capacity building are currently negotiated. There is a cost to fragmenting legal discussions around physicality, informational content, ownership, and benefit sharing. So for instance, rather than viewing the definition of genetic resources as a technical problem and whether the scope of the term ought to or ought not to include digital sequence information and data, we need adaptive solutions to the problem. There are multiple stakeholders, institutions, and behaviors that need to be changed in order for us to see the ocean genome as one entity. And finally, the ocean genome does not divide itself according to legal jurisdictions. Benefit sharing from use of the ocean genome needs a multilateral approach. So here, contrary to the siloed approach of the BBNJ negotiations, we find that recognition of the potential of the ocean genome as a resource requires adaptive, coordinated, and multilateral responses. Here are some specific highlights that the author team present in the report, and these include funding objectives like taxonomic research and genetic monitoring as part of existing environmental assessments, coordinating private initiatives, which we feel are very important, enhance legal capacity around critical issues of technology transfer, benefit sharing, and intellectual property. based on these highlights, we urge for the development of an ethical code of conduct or a declaration of coordinated ocean action. These highlights are encapsulated in 8 opportunities for action that we present in the report. Now, these opportunities for action arose from a multidisciplinary and dialogic approach to the problems we set out to analyze. I would like to thank all the authors here for the rich discussions that contributed to our conclusions on the ocean genome, including with HLP reviewers. And now, at this time, more than ever, we need to see that the least damaging approach is one that is not based on narrow self-interested action, but one that centralizes our ambitions for a shared future. A sustainable ocean economy should prioritize the conservation and sustainable use of the ocean genome and lead to equitable outcomes for all. With that, I'll pass you over to Christian.
Thank you so much, Shiva, Kirsten, and the rest of the authors on this blue paper. Tremendous stuff. And I think ending on such a sobering and important note about our shared future couldn't be more important today than ever before. So certainly something that we need to be thinking about, not only with this issue, but a whole range of issues that the ocean faces at this time. I'd like to now move to the panel discussion. You'll see all of the authors, the lead authors have joined us. Kristen, Shiva, of course, joined by Rachel from Cape Town, Robert in Stockholm, and Alex here in the UK. Thank you all for your hard work on this, and to all your authors as well, and being with us today. I'd like to kick off with a few questions that have certainly come to mind over this to kind of get the conversation flowing a little bit. I see some questions are coming in on the question and answer session, and we'll kind of pick those up in the audience Q&A session shortly. But let me maybe, Robert, let me turn to you first. This to me is a paper that I think really takes a science-based approach to defining the ocean genome, and I think it not only does it call out the importance of the ocean genome as a resource, but it starts to, I think what I think is really impressive and unique is that it starts to really bring in the different legal and governance implications of equitable use and its conservation, right? So I think that's a really important dimension of this, especially as we start to break down these sectors and think about more holistically how we treat the ocean and manage it. But I think, well, obviously a question comes to mind, Robert, is why is it important to have a clear definition of the ocean genome at this stage?
Yeah, thanks so much, Christian. And I like the way you phrased the question, because it's, in a way, you're already saying the answer, which is that it really is about assembling this diverse group of expertise. And just sitting back and watching Shiva and Kirsten present the whole paper again, it made me reflect on the last year and a half working with this team, because in the very beginning, we had a bit of a more narrow focus. I mean, we were looking more at just commercial applications, biotechnology. And then as our group grew, we realized we can't just stay in that territory. We're going to be so constrained if we try to understand the ocean genome just through this lens. And I think that's what so much of us do. But as soon as you start stepping out of your comfort zone and talking with people like Shiva, an IP lawyer, or people like Kirsten, one of the experts on marine spatial planning and conservation, or people like Rachel, who've just got such deep experience with access and benefit sharing, then you immediately have to start thinking bigger. And to me, that's what the ocean genome is all about. It's about elevating that discourse. So you're not staying in a silo. You're not just thinking about one piece of the puzzle. But if you have anything to do with the ocean genome matters to you. If you're an ocean-based industry, it matters to you. If you're a tourism minister, it matters to you. And if you're engaged in biotechnology and biodiscovery, it matters to you too. So that's, to me, that's been the journey of the paper. It's been moving out of that approach and becoming bigger and more encompassing, and then somehow boiling it all down into a definition that fits in one sentence.
Interesting. You make a good point there in terms of the genesis of the paper. What a multidisciplinary group you have together. And, some of you may not have met each other before. You're coming together and really thinking this through from different perspectives. And I think that's what we need now. We need a lot of these big intractable ocean challenges. We really need to come at it at a multidisciplinary approach and looking at it through different lenses and expertises that we can then bring that together. And I think, as you rightfully point out, this is going to help us as part of the move to beyond the sort of the sector by sector approach on the ocean activities and management. And so I like that framing that you guys have taken and moving this forward. And hopefully, this will be picked up by the panel and some of the governments and some of the negotiations as a real contribution to moving out of those siloed approaches, those different sectors. But of course, this is all predicated on the health of the ocean. And we know that there is numerous studies indicating the trend in biodiversity loss around the world. And Alex, you've done a lot of work on this and looking into this and done a lot of publishing on this. And so no better person than to comment on this. But is this having an effect on the ocean genome? I mean, is this there's a lot of genetic diversity in the ocean, incredible amounts. But is this loss and the impact that we're having at the moment really having an impact on the ocean genome now?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Christian. I mean, what we do know is that in terms of scientific observations, we've lost relatively few species that we know of in the ocean compared to land. But of course, as Kirsten pointed out, we've only actually described 10% of the marine biodiversity out there. So there's a good chance we're losing diversity that we don't even know about at the moment. The other thing is we do know that the abundance and the range of many species has really been severely reduced, almost to the point, well, in fact, to the point for some species of economic and ecological effective extinction. Also, from data from the IUCN Red List, we know that the levels of extinction threat amongst marine species pretty much reflects the same range that we see on land. So that gives us real pause for thought in that it is likely that marine species are suffering from the same levels of extinction as on land, or may well be. Does this lead to loss of genetic diversity? Well, yes. We know that when we lose stocks of fish, particular genetically distinct stocks, or particular populations of animals, the genetic diversity of that species is reduced. We know from observations that human activities like fishing have a measurable impact on the genetic diversity of the target species. And of course, when you lose that genetic diversity, what you're losing is the capacity of that species to adapt to things like environmental change and other aspects of human exploitation of the ocean and impacts on the ocean. We also lose redundancy at the ecosystem level as well. And these are all things we talk about in the report.
Yeah, Alex, can I pick up on this point a little bit further? Can you give a little sense, maybe be specific in terms of some of the major drivers? Maybe just, I know there are lots, but in your mind, what would you say are maybe the top 3 or 4 major drivers for this decline that are obviously going to be impacting the ocean genome?
Well, the major drivers are essentially overexploitation of marine living resources. So overfishing and the collateral damage from fishing is the #1 driver if you look at the drivers of extinction threat in the IUCN Red List. Then it's really habitat destruction and habitat loss, particularly in coastal ecosystems. We've seen 30 to 50% loss of many important coastal habitats. So mangrove forests, coral reefs, salt marshes, and so on. Then we have a range of other impacts linked with coastal degradation is pollution. Invasive species are a very interesting impact on marine ecosystems that also affect diversity and ultimately genetic variation in populations.
That's interesting. So that starts to speak to, how do we mitigate those? And perhaps there's some conservation measures that we need to put into place. And Kirsten, you have a lot of background thinking about marine reserves and protection, and I wondered, can I come to you on this one? And because Alex has really framed starkly the drivers of and the impacts that we're having. How can we be protecting and conserving the ocean in such a way that it protects the ocean genome? And we need to balance sustainable use with effective conservation, and we've talked about the mantra of the panel about sustainably producing, effectively protecting, and equitably prospering. So maybe can you just give a little sense about what's your thinking, and what's the thinking of the paper as far as the protection of the ocean genome and the existing mechanisms or ones that we need to aspire to protect the genome?
Yeah, thanks, Christian. Well, and certainly Alex's statements, when you hear the reality of what the ocean is facing, as you say, the next thing in line is to talking about what we can do about it. I think the good news is that, in fact, protection of the ocean has made great strides in the last decade, especially. We're seeing an increase in the number of platforms where big announcements about ocean protection are taking place, like the UN Ocean Conference, like the Our Ocean Conference. Countries are really showing, along with industry and other groups, their commitment to protection. We see that reflected in the Convention on Biological Diversity and Sustainable Development Goal, targets for 10% by this year. Yeah. I think the reality, like we talked about within the paper and in the presentation, is that a single number is a very coarse indication of kind of where we are with protecting the ocean. We know that about 8% of the ocean is in any type of marine protected area, but really there are lots of different flavors of those. In fact, many MPAs include a lot of extractive and destructive activities. And so when you boil that down, as I said, really only 2.5% of the ocean is fully or highly protected. And we know that the science says it should be more. And so really, I think that's where our focus is shifting away from not only the quantity, but the quality of protection. And it's in benefit not only for biodiversity, but for us. And that's because there's so many amazing incentives for protecting this and sustainably using it. If we are sustainably using it, as we all hope to do, who knows if there is next great cure hidden in the depths of the ocean. We know we want to move forward cautiously. We want to make sure that we're taking into account rare and vulnerable and threatened species in our sustainable use. And we want to make sure that we're avoiding the degradation of habitats, like I said. But I think I'm sure that Robert would have something really insightful to say about the incentive side of things.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Robert. Do you want to come in? I saw you nodding your head quite a bit. You want to come in?
When Kirsten talks, I usually nod my head because
great.
Always spot on. In my current work, I engage with the Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship Initiative and with the UN Global Compact Action Platform. And in some of these platforms, you start to really get out of your comfort zone. And to me, that's a sign that maybe I'm in the right place, because that means talking with people from industry who aren't maybe someone you would assume to be allies in trying to conserve the ocean and the ocean genome. But whatever you can do to nudge industry, or not just nudge, to push industry towards more sustainable activities in the ocean, lightening the footprint, then that's also going to be to their benefit. And if you can show that this is something that benefits industry, it benefits biodiversity, and it's part of this package. It's not just about drawing a line around part of the ocean, setting it off as MPAs, but also making sure that outside of MPAs, we're doing as much as we can to make sure that we're conserving the ocean, the biodiversity, and the genetic diversity in it.
Yeah, I think that genetic diversity is important. So we're really starting to demonstrate more and more the more depth and breadth that marine protected areas can bring to the ocean. And I think when you're talking about we're not just talking about biological diversity. We're now talking about genetic diversity and the ocean genome contained within. So there's some really important points that are coming up there. But in amongst, of course, all this, we have the increasing commodification of these genetic resources, and we need to have these legal mechanisms. And I think we probably see some of these patents that are coming up for many of these products in the pharmaceutical industry really, coming to the forefront. And I think probably no more so than today and going into the future, right? And I think many people are probably going to be looking at that closer. And I think the paper does a great job at starting to explore that and start to, think about these dimensions of the patents and calling for the disclosure of the origin of these patents in that murky world that is there. And I think what I'd love to hear a little bit more about, perhaps, and Shiva, maybe I can come to you on this, is should we be disclosing this information? I mean, or is it something that we should just let people get on with it and let the commercial activities go forward? But maybe are there some pros and cons here, or advantages and disadvantages? Love to learn a little bit more about that.
Great. Thank you, Christian, for that question. And I imagine that's something that is on the minds of quite a few of our audience as well. This has risen to the top as one of the more controversial issues of the BBNJ process. And it's also striking to me how having a multi-author group has helped with coming up with this resolution to the problem, because we know from talking to the scientists that this information on origin or source exists. It's part of most scientific protocols. So then the burden of justification shifts. And I would then ask, why would you not want to disclose origin or source when it is an important part of the contextual information of your sample? I would also say that patent specifications are important sources of technical and legal information. So this sort of disclosure is well within the remit of what we expect our patent systems to do for us, and that is to disclose information. In terms of, if you want to phrase the question in terms of pros and cons, I see there are administrative burdens that this might imply. There might be behaviors that need to be changed, but I don't see these as disadvantages given the benefits that it will bring in connecting the ocean genome as a single entity. So from the point of first discovery to commodification, we are able to keep track of what is happening to the ocean genome.
That's interesting. And so there's obviously, I think it seems to me that there's a lot more work to do on this, and it's a really fastly emerging area, and especially in the context when we start exploring a new implementing agreement for the high seas. I think this is increasingly going to be important when we talk about marine genetic resources, benefit sharing, especially the equitable component that is brought up really starkly in this paper. I think is a really important dimension to this. Of course, within this, of course,
I would sort of add there to say that I don't see this as a big hurdle to overcome. If anything, I see this as something that's already in play. It's the direction of travel in a number of international frameworks. And I think it's time for scientists to start making their voices heard in terms of making this a legal requirement. And I think Robert might have something here that he could add to this from the perspective of scientists.
Yeah, great.
Sure. I mean, I agree with what she was saying, but in terms of the legal framework and the negotiations, this is really tricky territory. So I tend to kind of move away from that a bit and think of voluntary measures. So I think that there are a lot of things that can be done right now by scientists or even companies that are really committed to transparency and see value and kind of positioning themselves already as leaders in transparency to show. It's just another way of showing that they're complying with the Nagoya Protocol and international law. Just put it in there. Yep. And as Shiva said, they're probably collecting information anyway. Just go ahead and put it in the applications and so forth. That would be kind of the direction. But of course, there's so much value in having it actually formalized in international law. But that's the headache of Ambassador Uludong and the negotiators. And I don't envy them that challenge, but I think that a lot can be done on a shorter time scale with voluntary measures.
So it's a big one, but what I'm hearing, it's not insurmountable and that we can overcome this real quickly. And also, I've also heard that this is both about big carrots and big sticks, to put bluntly on it, to look for those incentives, but also, let's close those loopholes so that we're not losing that equity dimension and distribution of the benefits from that. In the paper, you described the genome, but you have the actual physical gene, but then there's this interesting dimension of the information that's encoded in that gene. And we haven't heard from Rachel yet, and you've been very patient there, and I'd love to come to you now on this, Rachel. And perhaps explore this a little bit more in terms of are there ways, or how can we benefit share from the so-called digital sequence information in the marine environment? Can you give us a little bit more sense on that? Because I think this is a really important dimension as we think about more about increasingly technological and digitized world and sharing of information, and especially as we go into the decade of ocean science. So Rachel, please, over to you. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Parts of
go ahead.
We can hear you. It's one of the unique parts of our report, is that we're looking at the ocean genome not only in terms of the physical genetic resources, but also the information that they encode. And this is a question that's coming up in multiple negotiation fora, including the CBD's Nagoya Protocol, and of course in BBNJ negotiations, as Siva has indicated. It relates to both terrestrial and marine environments, but the marine environment brings an additional layer of complexity for the reasons that we've been talking about. Historically, benefit sharing has centered on the collection and the use and the commercialization of these physical resources. But as we heard, the costs of genetic sequencing have decreased, the interest in the genome has increased, and this field of bioinformatics has exploded. So there's been an increased shift towards the use of genetic sequence data, or the terminology that's used in negotiations right now is digital sequence information, or DSI. And the concern really is that while access to the physical resources, at least in coastal waters under national jurisdiction, is regulated by national laws, this isn't the case for DSI, which is uploaded onto these massive international databases. And the data is generally available for free use through public or open access.
Yeah.
So this then creates a loophole for users to avoid the equitable sharing of potential commercial benefits that arise from its use, and the risk that the countries of origin or the regions of origin won't receive any benefits. And once one goes into the deep sea arena, of course, the question becomes even trickier because of the unresolved issues with regard to ownership and access. And then there's a mismatch, of course, between the political and ecological boundaries, which adds to this very complex framework. So there's an increased call that DSI has to be regulated in some way in terms of its access and use. And the problem is that the monitoring of this becomes really difficult over time because sequences pass through multiple hands, they get modified, they have their identities eroded. And there's a major concern that if you restrict access, then really important work on discovering new drugs, for example, for COVID-19 and other diseases would be thwarted. And really important conservation solutions would also be impeded. And we've seen that already in the context of ABS implementation throughout the world, that there's this negative impact on biodiversity research. And we obviously want to avoid that.
Yeah.
So ABS law has evolved out of kilter, really out of the science. And we're only starting now to think of what some possible solutions are. One of them could be some kind of multilateral benefit sharing fund. This is under discussion now. Where you de-link access for databases to benefit sharing. And this means that access to the databases wouldn't be impeded, but there could be some sort of biodiversity charge or levy that's paid into a fund for any data used that could then be directed towards biodiversity conservation or tech transfer or other priorities that we've heard about today. And obviously it would have to be refined depending on the different users. Low-income countries would have to have different big pharmaceutical company, for example. So these are some of the ideas that are being discussed. And aside from the financial solutions, we also really need to think about the databases themselves and who has access, which is what Ambassador Ola was referring to earlier. Many countries lack sufficient molecular research capacity. They don't have biotech infrastructure. They don't even have computing capacity and bandwidth to benefit from access. So we're looking at some kind of platform that's tackling these questions holistically across the board.
Interesting. I'm mindful of time, and I do want to be sure that we go into the into our audience to pick up on some of the questions. The questions are coming in thick and fast. But what I'd like to just hear from just a quick sentence or two from each of you, because I'd be remiss if I didn't take advantage of the expertise that you all represent here. You know, we're in, as I opened it up, and as we all acknowledged, and we're in the midst of this unprecedented, you know, pandemic, and I wondered, you know, each of you think, is there an element of this report that you think is most relevant, you know, for the post-COVID world? So maybe if I'll just go across my screen here. Shiva, can I come to you first? Just a really brief comment on that, please.
Yes, certainly. I think what the pandemic does is it doesn't raise new issues, it just exposes issues that already existed in scale and acuteness. So these issues of disparity and access to medicines and affordable technologies, for instance, has always existed. But the pandemic has brought together new sorts of political will, and we've seen some action from state parties, including the WHO, moving towards making these medicines and vaccines available on different terms. So I think what the pandemic does is we can no longer say that access to medicines is a problem that happens over there to other people. Yep. The other people are us. So we need an approach where there's an approach to shared prosperity and equity for all of us in order to limit the damage from situations like these.
Interesting, very true. Kristen, very brief.
Yes, I just say that something that we've all really observed from this pandemic is the spotlight it's shown on how interconnected we all truly are with each other, all of us taking shelter in our own homes, but also with nature. And I think that can be a real source of solution. I hope we can carry that feeling moving forward. We are interconnected with the ocean genome, and so thus interconnected with the solutions.
Yeah, very good point. Robert, briefly.
Oh, I think that any of the work that's being done now with new compounds or promising antivirals, it's all based on collections that were done in the past, research that was done in the past. So basically, an investment in understanding the world is going to help us react to it better in the future. So we can't scramble and do it now. It's really based on the investments we made in the past, and that's going to show how well we can react now.
Interesting on the important innovation. Alex, very briefly.
Yeah, I think the COVID-19 crisis has really demonstrated the link between humans, the environment, and the use of wildlife. And there's a fascinating concept coming out of the health world and veterinary science called One Health, where you have to really look at, you know, these complex problems like pandemics in that context, the interconnectedness of humans, the environment, and wildlife.
Yeah, very interesting, very good point, interconnectedness. And finally, Rachel, to you before I open the floor for some additional questions.
I think, not to repeat the others, but the relevance of science, you know, and the importance of science in finding potential solutions, but also the importance that we don't jeopardize those opportunities through over-exploitation or degradation of the ocean.
Yeah.
Those are two really important points.
Yeah, indeed, yeah, definitely don't jeopardize that, for sure, something that we don't even know about. I'm going to turn very quickly to the, I've got some great questions here, and I'd ask our panelists, if I may be so bold, if you would try to answer them as succinctly as possible so we can get through a number of these, and of course, if you want to follow up, then we can make those connections. Kristen, I'm going to come first to you. The question is, genetic material is already part of the CBD definition for biodiversity. Why should we use the term, ocean genome? Is there any added value by differentiating that?
Oh yeah, great question. So right, the CBD does include material genetic resources as part of the biodiversity definition. I think it's defined as genetic material of potential or actual value. So certainly that's a facet of what we've spoken about today. I'll harken back to Robert's answer earlier about the truly multidisciplinary, multifactorial approach to what we mean as the ocean genome. It's not just about the genetic material, it's about the services they provide beyond just commercial services, but also our provisioning, ecological services. So I think bringing in this concept really gets us to a place where we can start addressing issues of equity and doing it holistically.
Yeah, interesting, very, very good point. Rachel, question to you. Is there a role for the fishers in exploring the potentials of ocean genome, or is this the exclusive realm of scientists and developed countries? What are your thoughts on that, Rachel?
I think that's a really, really important and good question. Absolutely, there's a really exciting and innovative, I think, opportunity to bring for not only fishers, but local communities as well, local coastal communities who live closest to the resources, not necessarily only understanding the specific resources, but also the geography of those habitats. I think there's some really interesting research that reveals the importance of local ecological knowledge in directing all kinds of fishing activities. So yes, but it's very, very underexplored at the moment. There's been much more work in the terrestrial realm. We're working with traditional healers around medicinal potential of particular plants, for example. In the marine world, I think it's underdeveloped, and I think it's a really exciting opportunity for the future.
I think it's really interesting, and sort of really broadens the notion of equity and capacity building, and really building that out. So it's not just the domain of scientists in developed countries, but really trying to broaden that out. Shiva, coming to you. Genetic material and digital sequence information, DSI, as Rachel said, within national jurisdiction is governed by sovereign states. Okay, so the question is, what is the likelihood that they would agree on a multilateral regime for DSI for the ocean?
I think Rachel did a good job of addressing this question, but if I could emphasize slightly different points, 2/3 of the oceans is beyond national jurisdiction. So we're talking of potentially a large quantity of data that will not come under the sovereign framework. Yeah. I also would like to draw attention to how difficult it has been to ensure bilateral architecture that the CBD implies when it comes to DSI and data, digital sequence information and data. For these two reasons, I think a multilateral mechanism that takes equity and responsible and inclusive innovation into account is really the way forward.
Yeah, no, it certainly sounds like from the discussion that we've been having around this and some of the points that Ambassador Uladong had made. Robert, coming to you, how can the ocean genome help us understand the connectivity in the ocean?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Well, I think one of the really exciting things for me, which I learned from engaging with this group, was that there's been so much advancement in actually sampling and understanding the ocean at a genetic level. So using environmental DNA, which is just shed by species as they interact with their environment, you can actually get almost a real-time snapshot of what's living in that area. And by doing that, you can get not just the stuff that's sitting there around your sampling, like maybe you get a little bit of that anemone or whatever, but you also get all the stuff that's going to swim away as fast as possible when it sees you jump in the water. So you get a much better view of what's actually there. And then based on that, you're going to be able to understand more about how migratory paths of marine organisms are formed. You learn more about the spread of pathogens. You learn more about just about everything. And you can also design marine protected areas and conservation measures more effectively. So to me, that's super exciting. And our colleagues in South Africa, Carrie Sink and Jessica Da Silva, contributed a lot on this in the report. It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I know. I think it's totally fascinating that when you start talking about this genetic connectivity and that distribution and drift that's going on, it opens up whole dimensions on how we understand different ocean basins and how they're connected. Alex, someone on the line here has picked up that about the limited amount of information that we have, but what they're asking for is, can you provide some reflections on how we should be using the limited information we do have to effectively protect the resources from threats? And this is particularly at a time they say here when governments and intergovernmental bodies are deciding on opening up the ocean to deep sea mining. So love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, we've only described 10% of marine species. However, we do have we've got a fairly good grasp of the overall patterns of how that diversity is actually distributed. And we also have some understanding of how genetic diversity connects different populations of the same species, at least in very broad terms. So I think we can use that knowledge that we already have to really think about where to place fully or highly protected marine protected areas, for example, so that we actually conserve representative areas of all the major habitats and ecosystems. We also know a lot, thanks to new technologies in tracking marine life, about where organisms migrate and their migratory routes. So we can actually implement temporal measures to protect those migratory species. So I think just in the last decade alone, we've actually accumulated a lot of knowledge that really helps us to manage the ocean at a global, regional, and even local level.
So really almost a dramatic increase in that just on our understanding through a small amount of information, and the mind boggles if we were thinking about how that could expand and the more information and what we would do with it. Robert, there's a point that's come up here that someone wants specifically pointing to some information about the enzyme polymerase derived from ocean extremophiles that is currently in commercial use. Are there any examples of that come to mind? Recognizing that, not want to put you on the spot, but it's quite an interesting question about some where someone could go to find out more information on that.
I'm being muted and unmuted by there we go. I would suggest going to one of our colleagues, Marcel Jaspers, who was on this call. He's at the University of Aberdeen. He'll be able to get you up to date right away. I could spit a few things out, but they might not be quite right. So I'd go right to Marcel. He's listed in the paper, and you'll find him easily with a Google search.
Perfect. And we'll have an email address at the end if anyone has any further questions to the ocean, to our secretariat, and then we can forward them onto the authors. A couple more questions I think we have time for, panelists. This one is directed towards Rachel and Shiva. And the question is, are you advocating restricting access to sequence data in an effort to improve equity? And if so, is that a trade-off between transparency and equity? Maybe Rachel, do you want to come in and then Shiva follow up?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean the solution that I was proposing was one, and which is still very much under discussion, and there hasn't been any resolution on this. But I think there seems to be a consensus evolving that access to data should not be restricted, and that one should delink the access and benefit sharing requirements, so that there's some kind of system whereby, so the levy that I mentioned, for example, everyone who accesses the data proportionately based on their size and user sector and so on, would pay some sort of levy towards a fund for conservation or for responsible and equitable research partnerships. But I think the last thing that we want to be doing is restricting access to database. That's going to clamp down on any kinds of opportunities to find new and important products, and restrict biodiversity research.
Shiva, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to. So the short answer is no. The long answer is, I think this requires us to investigate how intellectual property law can sometimes get in the way of open access data or become a cog in the system. Because at the moment, we don't have a way of ensuring that all the data that's put out there in the public domain is not repropertized through intellectual property rights. So there are multiple issues with open access data. So while I'm not advocating for restricting access to this data, far from it, I do think we should investigate all the informal and insidious ways in which this data is in fact subject to appropriation.
Oh, some very, I think, very important point to end on, if I may. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I looking at the questions, there are another 25 questions that have come up, and just in the time we're talking. So you can imagine this has stimulated a lot of interest, and unsurprising to me, I think for many years I thought that you know, the ocean genome was a real big question in my mind, and worthy of exploring further and understanding the full sort of multi-dimensionality of it. I think all of you authors should be commended on such a terrific job at bringing that together as best as possible, and really giving us something to think about. And if I reflect back on some of the earlier sort of questions that I opened up this session with around you know, the opportunities for developing conservation and management measures as well as commercial applications, clearly that is the case. We're going to know more information, we're going to be collecting more, the digitization is going to improve that. And I think that we need to be thinking about that very carefully, though, because there's also the importance for ecosystem integrity, for our ocean health, for our economies, and we need to place this in context in the right economic, political, and legal regimes and policy regimes that are there. And not forgetting the equity dimension of this, you know, truly important to many people around the world that are perhaps going to be benefiting in one way or another by the ocean genome. I thought it was interesting that came up to me that you know, whilst there are some barriers to sustainably use and equitably share, it sounds like, for me, what I'm hearing from all of you, that this is easy, you know, not easy, but it's overcomable. And if we really put our heads together and continue this, especially with the opportunities of action that you lay out, I think it's very clear in terms of the path forward that what needs to happen and the steps that need to be taken. I encourage us all to explore that further and think about and reflect upon our own disciplines, our own spheres of influence and sectors that we operate, to see how we can integrate the ocean genome into some of the work we do, because I only see it growing, this issue. You know, certainly based on what we're seeing now with the pandemic, but over the next decade with the decade for the UN decade for ocean science. And I think you know, that there were an unprecedented time in terms of technology and innovation, and I'm sorry we didn't have the time to explore that with you further, because I think that really is transformative as far as the sort of learning more about the ocean genome and making this information available, visualizing it, giving it context, and going forward. But thank you so much for taking the time with us today out of your busy schedules and all the great work that you're doing. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank your co-authors on the line as well. I know that they probably have joined from around the world, and we do thank you very much for the work that you have done on this. And it really speaks to the sort of way of working that many of you may not have spent, you know, physically in the same spot before, and actually you've managed to pull this whole thing together, like many of the other blue papers, by connecting like this and sharing your thoughts and ideas. So terrific, absolutely terrific. So again, thank you, and you know, to remind us all that this is the first of another 10 blue papers that will be released and launched. The next one being on the 14th or the 12th of May. The 12th of May, hosted by our colleagues in Mexico. I do hope that you will join us for others and look for those. We'll certainly send reminders around to everybody. And I would also like to thank my colleagues on the line at the Secretariat, who have been working extremely hard at putting this together and getting us all around the virtual table and making it so seamless. I think it's a truly amazing job to pull this all together and seem to work very well. So again, thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us and spending the last 90 minutes with us exploring this amazing and interesting topic. The paper can be found online. You'll see the website there. Please, if you have any comments or thoughts and ideas or reflections, use the Ocean Panel Twitter handle. And we remain at your disposal. If you have any further questions, contact us at info@oceanpanel.org. So with that, I'm Christian Teleke. I lead the Secretariat for the high-level panel, and I thank you very much and wish you all safe and productive times going forward. Again, thank you very much. Bye-bye.